In a recent article for The Atlantic magazine, the journalist Tom Nichols says when he was in college, there were reminders about the threat of nuclear war everywhere in popular culture. It's one of the reasons he says there was this prevailing anxiety about the future because films and the media made a catastrophic conflict seem real and immediate. Movies offered spectacle, but they were also warnings, and it gave Americans this shared vocabulary to talk about the unthinkable. But Nichols says these days a new generation has different fears, so they're not really thinking about the atomic age in the way he was when he was young. And he told us he noticed this when he was teaching a class about nuclear weapons.
And I had this actually happen a few times, but I still remember this one student in particular who said, look, I get it. Nuclear weapons are bad, but what were you all so afraid of? What was a big deal? I didn't even know what to say for a moment. And I pointed at the clock that was, above the lectern. And I said, because by the time our class meeting is over, most of the Northern Hemisphere could be dead. Hundreds of billions of people. And there was this kind of stunned look of, when did that become a thing? They were oddly both the beneficiaries and victims of a kind of cultural exhaustion that set in the early 1990s, just after the Cold War ended. Russia was our friend. We were reducing nuclear weapons pretty much as fast as we could. And so with the collapse of our ideological opponent, people wanted to move on. I mean, existential dread is exhausting, and people don't want to think about it. I don't blame them for that. And we pushed all these strategic nuclear issues into the background in the 90s so that, we could think about other things. But when I would ask students, I'd say, well, what are you afraid of? And almost universally, they would say climate change, which tells you that that's the message they're getting from their teachers, from the culture, from the general environment around them. And I would say, well, yeah, okay, you're worried about the planetary temperature increasing 2 degrees in 25 or 30 years. I'm still worried about it increasing 10 million degrees in 20 minutes. And that's where our disconnect is. And again, they just kind of looked at me like, but climate change is likely to happen and nuclear war isn't. And I said, true, but climate change and terrorism, these are not world-ending things. We will cope with climate change. We will reverse some of it. We will change where we live or how we build houses. We can adapt. But I said, if we do this, in the next hour, there is no coming back. It's final and it's done. And again, I just found that students couldn't really get their arms around that. Nuclear weapons just didn't do it anymore. All of that got pushed out of the minds of younger Americans. And I said, okay, we really have to back up. And so I started a new course about this stuff, kind of looking back at the pop culture of the Cold War and, making that a kind of history, political science excursion. And it became a pretty well-subscribed class every year because younger people were just shocked to find out over and over again how marinated, how soaked in fears of nuclear Armageddon previous generations were. And it really struck me that two things hadn't occurred to them, that it could happen and that people grew up with this. They were, really kind of stunned to think that a whole generation of Americans had an experience, multiple generations of Americans had an experience that was really quite opaque to them.
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. So today on the show, let's take Tom Nichols' article in The Atlantic and talk about how Americans are thinking about the atomic age now, a moment when nuclear power is on the rise. The name of his article is Damn You All to Hell. That's a spoiler, but hopefully you've seen Planet of the Apes from 1968 by now. Nichols says public consciousness about a nuclear threat has faded, but it wasn't so long ago when it was an everyday reality.
It wasn't something that we rediscovered every day. It was just woven into our lives. I used to play a kind of game with my students in my nuclear weapons and Cold War pop culture class where I would tell them when they're walking around, see how many fallout shelter signs they can still see. Now, when I went to school, they were everywhere. Fallout shelter signs were just always there. And my students, once they realized it, they started seeing them and they would come in and they'd say, Professor Nichols, I caught one in the wild, because they'd be in a subway and they'd find a grimy old fallout shelter sign.
Yeah.
And I'd say, yeah. And they were everywhere. And we just accepted that. We didn't look up and go, wow, hey, the basement of my church is a fallout shelter. We just went, okay, that's just part of life. I remember reading in the paper when I was in high school, my local paper, they had a story about I grew up next to an Air Force base. Yeah. So this had a real profound impact on me growing up literally next to nuclear weapons. And there was an article in the paper that said, now remember, if you're from that area, if you're from our area, your evacuation site during an attack is the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I lived in Western Massachusetts. Because apparently a lot of the buildings at UMass were big and made of granite, and there was a lot of, capacity for dorms and food and things like that. And I remember thinking, if World War III seems to be in the offing, I'm supposed to turn to my parents and say, we got to drive up to UMass.
Yeah.
And then I kind of folded the paper and said, yeah, I know. And that, again, we just internalized it. We just said, yeah, that's a part of your life.
How much do you think, Tom, that internalized fear, that sense of impending doom, how much of that was just the material fact of the Cold War, and how much of that was shaped by the movies that you were watching or the television shows that you saw? What is the role of popular culture, movies and TV shows, in terms of, shaping a collective consciousness like that, do you think?
Yeah, strangely enough, I suppose once I studied this stuff in college and became an expert on it, it actually scared me more. The reason people go to horror movies, right? It's a way of coping with anxiety. I think some of that was true about movies about nuclear war, especially because they were often kind of campy science fiction stuff. But what they did do is constantly remind us that this was a possibility. But I think the bigger influence until the 1980s, until The Day After and other movies started coming out in the 1980s, I think we said, okay, again, we kind of internalized it. We said, yeah, scary. It could produce giant cockroaches and big radioactive spiders and, could wipe out the world. And we go see these movies because it's a way of just kind of processing through that anxiety.
Are you sort of making a case in the piece that it would be nice to find a current cultural vehicle to maybe revive a kind of awareness, that awareness that you felt, because this is a big part of the piece too, that threat is still there. It hasn't gone away. Are you sort of decrying the fact that there's not a vehicle that is making this point anymore?
I am, exactly. And I know that I'm not alone in this. Yeah. Catherine Bigelow, Oscar-winning director, is about to release a movie in October about a missile attack on the United States.
Yeah.
And I think that's good. We need a modern equivalent to something like Failsafe or The Day After. Failsafe was the kind of movie where here's all these very competent-looking adults. And, of course, Henry Fonda, right, America's dad, is playing the president. And you're watching this and realizing the horror dawning through the whole thing of there's nothing any of these people can do. They don't know what to do. That if something terrible happens, all these people that you think you can trust and that are in charge and running things and capable, they're going to be up the creek like everybody else.
You quote the Henry Fonda character as president saying something quite profound.
We're to blame, both of us. We let our machines get out of hand.
You sure the king's
Still,
dead, the
It was an accident. Two great cities may be destroyed. Millions of innocent people killed. What do we say to them, Mr. Chairman? Accidents will happen. I won't accept that. All I know is that as long as we have weapons... All I know is that men are responsible. We're responsible for what happens to us. Today we had a taste of the future. Do we learn from it or do we go on the way we have? What do we do, Mr. Chairman? What do we say to the dead? I think if we are men, we must say, this will not happen again. But do you think it possible? With all that stands between us. We put it there, Mr. Chairman, and we're not helpless. What we put between us, we can remove.
Mr. President.
Yes, Jay.
I can hear the sound of explosions from the northeast. The sky is very bright.
That's a very jolting moment. I worry about that now, that people don't think about these issues. And they say, well, everything out there just works and it's all automatic and it's going to be fine. When in fact, if a nuclear crisis comes upon us, there is no playbook.
It gets to, at least in my mind, something you write about Planet of the Apes. Rod Serling is responsible for the sort of the concept. He delivers, as you say in the piece, the biggest gut punch of cinema in the 1960s. Talk about that last scene, if you would. And then I want to get you to talk about how when you show students, when you show it to them, even though they're not thinking about a nuclear threat in the same way, they're still bowled over by that end. Would you just talk about that?
Serling was very deeply concerned about nuclear war, about war in general. Serling was a combat veteran. Yeah. He was a World War II veteran. And, for him, World War III was a very real concern. So he writes to explain this world where, apes are the dominant species and humans are these mute animals. He holds back the big reveal, which is that the astronaut, Charlton Heston, the hero here and living through all this, he thinks he's on a distant planet galaxies away and this is just a screwed up, weird world. What he finds out, of course, is that a massive nuclear war has turned the world upside down. Humanity has destroyed itself. The apes rose as the natural successor to mankind. And he finds this out. Heston rides away. He's warned by one of the apes, don't go there. You're not going to like what you find. And one of the other apes says, well, what will he find? And the answer is his destiny. And he goes along the beach and finally gets to a point of the beach, gets off his horse, and has a breakdown and starts, screaming. And as the camera pulls back, you realize he's looking at the half-buried, ruined Statue of Liberty.
We finally really did it. You maniacs! You blew it up! Oh, damn you! God damn you all to hell!
And he realizes he's been home all this time. The credits roll, and all you hear is the lapping of the shore against the beach. And that moment produces a lot of silence in the classroom. And it does make them think.
One of the things you mention in your article is you sort of make this contrast to the way we used to talk about this stuff compared to the way we have or the way we do or don't, I guess, like these deep conversations. There was this television program, and I'll have you sort of work us through this, but they broadcast this TV movie the day after. This was in 1983. But not only do they show this film, and you can sort of explain what it gets at, but then they have this primetime national conversation, this panel discussion about the implications. Like if they're basically, it's a national network modeling a national conversation about these deep issues that included people like Carl Sagan and Elie Wiesel. Talk a little bit about this, because this seems like a remarkable moment.
The day after was the most watched TV movie of its time. There were like 100 million people tuned in. And, they don't go deep into the scenario. It's basically the people who live near a missile base in Kansas and the effect of the war. So, at the end of the movie, it's bleak. Everybody's dead. People are rooting around in, the rubble. And most of the characters have died of radiation poisoning or burned to death or whatever. And instead of just saying, well, thank you and good luck with your nightmares, ABC then transitions to this very high level discussion that includes people like William F. Buckley.
The whole point of this movie is to launch an enterprise that seeks to debilitate the United States.
May I ask you just to move in a little closer to your microphone?
It seeks to debilitate the United States.
And Elie Wiesel.
I'm scared. I'm scared because I know that what is imaginable can happen. I know that the impossible is possible. I've seen the film, and while I was watching it, I had a strange feeling that I had seen it before. Except once upon a time it happened to my people.
And, not only a very kind of star-studded policymaker and opinion panel, but bipartisan.
I agree with that. I'm amazed to find myself agreeing with Mr. Buckley, but that is absolutely right.
Well, in that case, let me capitalize on that brief moment of agreement, because I suspect there won't be very many more. Dr. Kissinger.
And the audience is there, by the way. And they're asking questions. They are actually invited to participate. You look back on it and you say, what a better time in our political life that you could put a bunch of people across the board of varying political beliefs, and they would all have this informed and thoughtful discussion with each other and with experts and policymakers and writers sitting there answering their questions and disagreeing with each other in a very respectful way. And I think part of it was that the gravity of the issue commanded a certain amount of respectfulness. This movie was done almost as a public service. And it really did change the debate in America about a lot of things. And I think we just lack that seriousness. We lack that sense of purpose and threat about nuclear weapons in the 21st century. And I think that that's not only to our detriment as a people, but dangerous.
So it makes me wonder, let's go back to your students and the reaction you're getting about all this from younger people, different generation. What are they afraid of? What are their existential anxieties that they're thinking about if it's not a nuclear threat, which, as you point out, is still a nuclear threat?
Yeah, this is where I become a kind of cranky, curmudgeonly old man and say that young people have lived with a condition of high living standards, high levels of technology, peace and prosperity for so long that their threat horizon is either way far out with something like climate change or immediate with, the things that young people always worry about, which is, how can I get a job? Where will I live? When my generation was in its 20s, we worried about where will I get a job? How will I live? And we carried this internalized understanding that, the world could end in 20 minutes on top of everything else. It seems to me that when I would talk to my students and ask the question that you've asked, what is it you fear? It was much less concrete. I think, in a sense, the younger generations now are more fearful than we were because they have now 100 things that they worry about instead of one or two. And I think, again, that's not productive. My feeling is all problems can get fixed as long as we don't nuke the planet. But if we do this, then it's the end of all things.
Tom Nichols, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Tom Nichols, he's a professor emeritus of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. He's also a staff writer for The Atlantic. His article is called Damn You All to Hell, and we'll put a link to it on our website, radiowest.org. We'll take a break, come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. So for decades, Americans' ideas about nuclear weapons and power were shaped by the movies. In his Atlantic article, Tom Nichols says a new generation has moved on to other fears reflected in film. But the history of this cultural moment is really interesting. So we asked film scholar Andrew Nelson to go through some of it for us. He described it as a time when humankind had acquired a power almost godlike, and so movie makers had a lot to work with.
Well, I think I come at this through my interest in the horror genre. There's an interesting moment in the history of horror where, horror in the kind of conventional sense of classic monsters, universal monsters, the Frankensteins and Draculas and so on, goes away for almost a decade in the 1950s, following the Second World War. And in its place, we see the rise of a kind of a science fiction horror film where the monsters are no longer, supernatural creatures, but they're either extraterrestrials, threatening us from outer space, or they're, in many cases, irradiated monsters. So monsters, we have created through our meddling in matters beyond which humans are supposed to. So I come at it through that lens, I think, first and foremost. And, through the horror lens, of course, there's a long tradition of the plot that the film scholar Noel Carroll calls the overreacher plot, the plot about the scientist who meddles in things that are best left to the gods. Of course, we can think back to the Greek myth of Prometheus, the idea that there are some things that humans just aren't supposed to have.
Hubris.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Hubris and the idea that we're going to be punished for our overreach. So there's, of course, a long tradition of that as a foundational plot, I suppose, for us as a species to work through some of our anxieties. But we certainly see a lot of that in these science fiction films of the 1950s because it's very topical at the time. Of course, after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we see the destructive power that we now possess in a way that, humans have just never been able to destroy things on that scale ever before. So that's the moment where I guess I become of interest. And then we see how it develops in different types of films as it moves away from science fiction proper into scenarios that are, purportedly more fact-based, that deal with the way that nuclear technology is simply a part of everyday life. So whether that's nuclear power or whether that's, nuclear weapons and who wields them and how they wield them and when they choose to wield them.
So where do movies fit in terms of shaping how we think about things? I mean, does a film reflect the cultural attitude or create a cultural attitude? Because one of the things you've mentioned is culture is not a one-way street. So is the movie creating the anxiety or is the anxiety creating the movie, I guess? Put it that way.
No, that's the age-old question, not just about movies, but really any form of popular art. Is it a reflection of the zeitgeist? Is it just commercial mechanisms that are giving people what they want, that they've expressed an interest in through their choices of what to buy, what not to, what to patronize, what not to patronize? Or, is it the case of our, cultural betters, overseers, the superstructure imposing upon us particular messages or so on? Are we being manipulated in that way? That's a very binaristic way to look at film or really any art. It is, as you just said, I think a two-way street. And it's also the case that it's never that there's only one type of movie that is made at one particular time. This is one of my big bugaboos as a film historian. When we look back at film history, we often look at single films and we treat them as though there weren't alternatives to those films, different messages available in the marketplace. There almost always are. And then there's also different ways to look at individual films. It is amazing, and it never ceases to amaze me, and you and I have talked about this, how different people can go into the same film and come out with very different interpretations that most of the time confirm rather than challenge their worldview. So art is complicated. It's powerful not because it's simple, but because we have dynamic relationships with it.
One of the things Tom Nichols writes about in his piece is that the generational memory about, being afraid of the bomb has dimmed. What do you make of the way movies about nuclear bombs and the atomic age, how they shape the way we think about nuclear power or nuclear weaponry. Where do you think we are now in that sense?
That is a great question. The issue we'd probably want to deal with first is just the issue of human memory. So we of course have films from the period, and we can see that those films tell us at least something about how people thought or what they were afraid of. We wouldn't dispute that. But we have to remember that our own memories are faulty, and they themselves are constantly being rewritten, influenced by myriad factors, including media and other narratives. So the degree to which the fear of the bomb was pervasive, I question that. I think this is really complicated because we sometimes look back at the type of safety videos. These are very the sort of the duck and cover scenario, and this gets made fun of endlessly. Right. So was it a real threat? Absolutely. So the duck and cover example, that one gets made fun of a lot. Yeah. Right. So we look at that and we think, well, hiding under your desk in school is not going to protect you from a nuclear blast. That's true. But the real reason you were supposed to duck and cover is that there was the possibility that you'd be so far away from the blast, but it could still shatter all the windows. And so you'd be protected from all the shattering glass. Like there's actually historical dimensions to this that do get lost over time. So we can't dispute that. But then I've talked to lots of people who are not unlike people today, where we live at a time where there's always existential dread. The world could, I suppose, hypothetically end at any moment, and yet life goes on. So my impression of what it was like in the 1950s was not that every American lived believing that the end was imminent. We just have a remarkable capacity to keep on as things happen. I mean, life goes on. So I wouldn't want to overstate the degree to which the average American was, preoccupied with this. I think it was then the most recent in a long string of existential threats that we have faced.
When did films with nuclear theme? When did this begin? Did it after the actual bombings themselves in Japan? Did it take a while, or did we get to it fairly quickly that we wanted to say something about it in cinema?
Oh, pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It's not as though it comes out of nowhere. There are science fiction films in the 40s that are aware of experiments in atomic energy with atomic power, and that works its way into science fiction. But this idea of the atom age is really a post-World War II phenomena, and we see science fiction films especially responding very quickly to that, such that by the early 1950s, we're seeing cycles of different films that are engaged with nuclear subject matter. Probably the most famous of which is not an American film, though, is Gojira or Godzilla.
Well, we've talked about Godzilla before, so we don't need to work through all of those themes again. But let's do mention this is clearly, very explicitly about the consequences of nuclear technology, I guess.
Yeah, no question. And obviously the Japanese context makes it a much more immediate and, as you and I have discussed, a more serious movie than I think most people are expecting when they go into a Godzilla movie.
Well, that brings up a moment that I wanted to talk to you about. We've actually discussed this scene before, but I want you to sort of take us through this moment, which is really powerful. And it's just this exchange between two commuters. But it's a really powerful moment. And I wanted you to set this up for us and talk a little bit about this moment, if you would.
Right. So as you said, these aren't actual real characters in the movie. These aren't the main characters. One thing that Godzilla does is it not only shows us the destruction taking place in Tokyo, but we cut to scenes where we actually see individuals and how they're being affected. So this is an example of something that the movie does consistently. But we cut to the inside of a train, and there's a woman who essentially says, "I survived Nagasaki, and now this."
Yeah.
That moment really stays with me almost more than any kind of scene of remarkably, staged, spectacular destruction in the movie. It's just kind of haunting because it's so immediate, right?
Yeah.
It places this monster in the context of a real horrific incident, real destruction. But what I also like, and this gets back to what I said before, it's that attitude. It's like, well, we survived this, and now this. So on the one hand, it makes it so immediate, but it also says something about human nature, that we're always dealing with these threats.
Well, her fellow commuter says, "Back to the shelters again."
Yeah, exactly. Incredibly dark, incredibly immediate. And it's something that, distinguishes Gojira from, a movie like Them, about irradiated ants in the desert of the American Southwest. There's an immediacy to it where we recognize that it's not something happening in a remote area that might affect a few people who happen to come by it. This technology impacting millions of people.
Yeah.
And we're confronted with that again in the movie, that, this devastation isn't fictional, that they actually experienced something like this, and it wasn't at the hands of an irradiated lizard.
So Tom Nichols kind of makes this point that this younger generation of moviegoers, they don't think about nuclear power or destruction in the same way. And I guess he could make a case for what the monster Godzilla became over the years, because Godzilla stopped being a villain and started being a hero, protecting us from an external threat, as opposed to it being about us. I guess it was now about something else.
Yeah. The Godzilla that most of us are familiar with, the friendly, campy character who's not a villain but a hero and is protecting Earth from, extraterrestrial monsters and other threats. The one who, ambles out when his star is revealed on the Hollywood Walk of Fame is a hero. He became a hero over the course of the latter half of the 20th century. So certainly if that's the Godzilla then it's very far removed from the Godzilla of 1954 and what that monster was dealing with. But, but this is not unique to Godzilla or nuclear power, the idea that people look at old media and they don't know the context. I mean, that just happens. Movies are made presuming a certain degree of what we would call referential knowledge. There's some things they're just not going to explain because they don't have to. But, over time, those things do need to be explained. The Wizard of Oz becomes a much richer experience if you know something about its Great Depression context. And I've had many of these experiences as a film teacher where, it's kind of my job to situate films historically, to try to inform people about what it is that these films were trying to comment on. It's just the inevitable process. We're left with the art and that context fades away. And it's usually really by restoring that context, by getting back to the history, that we begin to realize that there's a reason why some of these films resonated so strongly initially, because they weren't just campy monster movies. It struck a chord that speaks to something deeper.
Andrew Nelson, he's a film scholar, used to be the chair of the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah. These days, he's chief curator of Western Spirit, Scottsdale's Museum of the West. We'll take another break and come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we've been talking about movies and the nuclear bomb. Here in Utah, leaders are hoping the state will play a role in an emerging era of nuclear power. So we've been thinking about what that's going to mean here, like the policy questions, safety, and waste. But we've also been interested in how popular culture was shaped by the fears of nuclear catastrophe. Andrew Nelson has been taking us through a kind of cinematic history of the atomic age. Let's get back to that conversation. So we asked you to give us some of the films that touch on the themes of, the atomic age and nuclear power. And one of the things you chose was On the Beach. This is Stanley Kramer's film from 1959. Why did you pick this one, 1959?
Well, I think it's kind of a forgotten film today. And even when it was released, it didn't do especially well. This is, an early example of part of a trend that becomes much more prominent in the 1960s of a large ensemble, all-star cast of characters dealing with some kind of topical issue. So in this case, it's a film about a post-World War III world where the Northern Hemisphere has been irradiated to the point where it's completely uninhabitable. And so we have our cast of characters, scientists, military men, widows, and so on, in Australia. And that's where the drama unfolds as they make a voyage to the Northern Hemisphere and come back. So I think it's an interesting, this is kind of an interesting time capsule, because it was a film that was, if you look at the promotion, promoted as something kind of ripped from the headlines that was very topical. reviews that were positive thought that it was an important film because it was weighing in on this very serious issue in a serious way. But it was kind of ignored by audiences at the time and has been forgotten. So I think it's important to remember these types of movies alongside those that we do remember, these ones that are forgotten or maybe consequently erased from history.
There's a scene you pointed out that I wanted to have you talk about, because there's this question in the film as they travel back to the United States, like after this global nuclear war, who survived? What survived? Tell us about this moment.
Right. So they begin to receive a signal in Morse code that's coming from the West Coast of the United States. And that part of the world, again, is believed to be completely uninhabitable. All life is not only dead, but no new life can live. So it's confusing that they would be receiving this signal. But it suggests that maybe either the reports about the habitability of the hemisphere are wrong, or maybe people have survived. It's about this glimmer of hope. And so we have a submarine that goes on, basically takes a apocalypse tour of the West Coast, starts in Alaska and makes its way down, and we see devastation, desolation, no people, landmarks, and so on. But then we finally do get to the source of this Morse code. And it is, one of the most effective and affecting moments in the movie, an incredibly pessimistic moment where it's revealed that it's not a person sending out this signal, but it's basically a freak accident where a Coca-Cola bottle has become wrapped in the cord from blinds and it's hitting against the telegraph machine. It's just the most absurd thing possible.
Window shade tugging on a Coke bottle.
It's the moment I remember most from this movie, and maybe the moment that the movie is most remembered for. And that, gives an indication of how this movie is not about how there's any hope for the future. It's about how it's hopeless.
Such a gut punch, that moment.
Oh, absolutely. And, the film, it's a well-made film. So it does build us up to think that maybe there is some kind of hope. But we are reminded repeatedly in this movie that this is not, a kind of a gung-ho science fiction picture where people will put aside their differences and come together to save the world. It is deliberately not that. It is a very serious, maybe self-serious counterpoint to those types of movies.
So that was 1959 when that came out on the beach. Now let's jump ahead to 1964, and Stanley Kubrick comes up with a very dark comedy with Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb.
Yeah, the subtitle very important in this particular case. And so this is the moment where Kubrick finds absurd comedy lurking in the same apocalyptic scenario.
General Turgidson, what's going on here?
Mr. President, about 35 minutes ago, General Jack Ripper, the commanding general of Burleson Air Force Base, issued an order to the 34 B-52s of his wing, which were airborne at the time, as part of a special exercise we were holding called Operation Dropkick. Now, it appears that the order called for the planes to attack their targets inside Russia. The planes are fully armed with nuclear weapons with an average load of 40 megatons each.
This is an interesting moment, and I think the comparison to On the Beach is opposite because, the serious take did not resonate with audiences, but the darkly comedic, farcical, satirical take is maybe one of the great films of the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah.
It's the type of film we would say is a classic. So, in this case, it's farcical because it's about things that we can relate to, bureaucratic incompetence, macho posturing, and, really just about the pettiness of people and how that results in, bureaucracy and just non-functional institutions.
General Turgidson, I find this very difficult to understand. I was under the impression that I was the only one in authority to order the use of nuclear weapons.
That's right, sir. You are the only person authorized to do so. And although I hate to judge before all the facts are in, it's beginning to look like General Ripper exceeded his authority.
It certainly does. Far beyond the point I would have imagined possible.
Well, perhaps you're forgetting the provisions of Plan R, sir.
Plan R?
Plan R is an emergency war plan in which a lower echelon commander may order nuclear retaliation after a sneak attack if the normal chain of command has been disrupted. You approved it, sir, you must remember.
You know, the idea that these kind of institutions, bureaucracies which are, you know, barely able to function would protect us under the most dire circumstances is, of course, laughable. And so the movie goes all in on that idea.
Mm. So it's not an axis of evil that's going to undo us, but just ordinary human error and institutional short-sightedness, basically.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like the doomsday device that destroys the world is something the Soviets just forgot to tell anyone about. That's it. Like, oops, no grand schemes, no grand plans, no conspiracies, nothing like that. Just the fact that highly mediocre people somehow end up in charge of our major institutions.
Well, and then in some ways, and this is something you said to us, maybe this is the most unsettling of all nuclear films.
I think so, because it's, what is it telling us? That the real threat isn't really the bomb, it's human nature, But in this case, it's not these classical themes like hubris or greed. Mm. It's, petty nationalism, sexual insecurity.
I can no longer sit back and allow communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion, and the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
Really just sheer incompetence.
Yeah. In 1979, the film The China Syndrome comes out. And the timing of that film is so interesting. Maybe you can talk about that. But it's about, just as a reminder, there's this reporter played by Jane Fonda. She's covering this kind of basic, routine human interest story at a nuclear power plant. But while they're there, her cameraman, played by Michael Douglas, captures what seems to be a near meltdown.
Fidelio.
Jack, Bill Gibson in the District's Gallery.
Yep.
We got some people here from Channel 3. They're shooting a TV news special at the plant. Listen, what the hell's going on down there?
It's just a routine turbine trip, Bill. Okay? So just take it easy. There's nothing to worry about.
I want to level in the reactor. We're still on main auxiliary, Colin.
Okay, relax. Everybody relax. Got high water in the core and I'm going to dump it. There's nothing to worry about. It's just a routine turbine trip.
This is certainly a moment where you could really ask the question that if history hadn't unfolded the way it had, would the movie have had the impact that it did? So in a kind of very perverse twist, 12 days after the China Syndrome was released, the 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster took place. Yeah. And, the studio didn't make anything of it, so this is not a moment where, evil Hollywood saw opportunity and decided to, wring our anxieties for every last cent. It's not that, but it's still, we can't help but see it as what seemed like a very eerily prescient moment.
I think it's interesting too, what seems like the central idea for you that came from that film wasn't just the pending disaster of nuclear holocaust or whatever, but the idea of individual conscience. That's the part of the film that strikes you most.
Well, the film is, there are a lot of films in the 70s, and I'm glad you led your synopsis with the journalists, because there are a lot of films in the 70s about enterprising journalists.
Yeah.
I mean, really, this is a kind of a Watergate film in many respects, right? The idea that the government or large institutions are often colluding together are doing bad things, and it's up to these heroic journalists, to come forward and expose it. So, that's part of the context of why this film gets made. So it's not necessarily solely because there was anxieties about nuclear power. It's that there was a popular story and we found it. But history very much made this not a Watergate film. It very much made it a film about nuclear power. But the interest to me is, again, getting back to this idea that it's not necessarily the technology so much. It's just human nature. It's greed and institutional failure. And the tension isn't really between, humanity and nature, let's say, but, between individual conscience. So Jack Lemmon plays the engineer, the whistleblowing engineer. And then, corporate power structures that prioritize profits over safety. It seems to bring us back yet again to the notion that it's really not so much the technology or the weapon, but the fallible humans who wield it.
Neither of us have seen Catherine Bigelow's film. She's got a new thriller. It's called A House of Dynamite. It just premiered at the Venice Film Festival. And basically it's about what happens if there's a ballistic missile on its way here. The missile is projected to hit Chicago within 20 minutes. And so the film is about how do we handle that? Is our national security system ready for something like that? What do you know of that film, and what do you think the theme here is saying about the way we're all thinking about this? Is this a reemergence? I mean, if Tom Nichols is making the point that the generational memory about, the nuclear threat is going away, is this a sense that it might be coming back in some way? Yeah,
that's a good question. Always hard to opine about films you haven't seen, but I have, I have read, some reviews, and what first strikes me is just how remarkably similar the response to this film is to films like The China Syndrome or On the Beach. The idea that these are ripped from the headlines, that they're terrifying because in the moment it seems plausible that this could happen to us. I mean, it seems very similar to some of the rhetoric we saw for another recent film, not about nuclear power, Civil War, the Alex Garland film. So as a film historian, I look back and I can trace this type of filmmaking, all the way back to maybe Warner Brothers pioneers this in the 1930s with their rip from the headlines. So it's interesting how not only this type of filmmaking, but the response to it just recurs. Now, is this a nuclear film so much as it's a film about those larger questions of who wields weapons? Do we trust the people who are wielding them? And are we prepared for the consequences? It seems like we're, especially in the context of this, this chat you and I are having, where we're looking at movies that go back to the 1950s, and we could probably think of examples of earlier. This isn't an especially new thing.
Yeah.
But that shouldn't surprise us. I mean, film is a young art form, so the idea that we're still using it to work through problems today in a way that we were 50 years ago shouldn't surprise us. Again, I guess it just seems to be less about nuclear power specifically than more about general anxieties at this moment about the people who are in charge.
Well, I guess that's where we can end it with this idea that, as you've said, this doesn't seem to be about public or national policy necessarily, or about the contamination of nuclear waste. It's like the bomb is a device to say something about us, what's wrong with us, I guess.
Yeah. We would never want to discount the fact that maybe some of these films have consequences. There are people who are strong advocates for nuclear power, and there's no question that, something like The China Syndrome probably did have a large impact on that. And, maybe that's for the good, or maybe that is to our detriment. But in thinking about these movies, it's striking that, the nuclear threat is really just a lens for examining what's already broken, whether it's monsters we create through weapons or experiments, wars that we precipitate through nationalism, accidents through incompetence, civilizations we build that repeat our mistakes. It's never the bomb. It's just that our existential failings have apocalyptic consequences. It just seems that these films are so much about human nature, and that nuclear power, nuclear weapons are just the ultimate amplifier of our flaws.
Andrew Nelson, thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.
Andrew Nelson, he's a film scholar, also chief curator of Western Spirit, Scottsdale's Museum of the West. Tom Nichols' article in The Atlantic is called Damn You All to Hell. We'll put a link to that on our website, radiowest.org. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're on YouTube at KUER 90.1. We're on Instagram at Radio West. And you can email us if you like at radiowest@kuer.org. The program is produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. Kerry Watson is our executive producer. I'm Doug Fabrizio.